1:32 here on the Sports Bash Saturday on 97.3 ESPN. Josh Hennig hanging out with you till 2 o'clock. We've been talking Sixers, and of course, Joel Embiid had surgery yesterday. So I wanted to get some in-depth insight. Dr. Stephania Bell, she works for ESPN. She's our injury expert. You've seen her probably a lot on fantasy football on Sunday mornings. She does a great job, and I wanted to bring her on because I feel like there's a little misunderstanding going on about what Embiid's surgery was, its impact, and the overall status of his health. Stephania, how you doing today?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you?
I'm doing good. So let's start out with what the Sixers have announced. The Sixers confirmed and announced that Joel Embiid underwent successful surgery. It was what they're calling minor arthroscopic surgery, and that it removed a small portion of the meniscus. So if you could just kind of give some information to the audience about what exactly this surgery was and the impact on Embiid's knee.
Well, I think there are certainly some things that you can take from the statement that was given by the surgeon who performed the operation, Dr. Neil Elatrash, who takes care of a number of elite athletes, considered one of the best orthopedic surgeons in the country. So clearly there was, he was in good hands. The team doctors were involved in all the decision making, as was Joel Embiid himself. He's taken a very active role in this. And I think the concern going in was that he might be headed for a meniscus repair. And the language that you see coming out of it is very specific, and I think helps us appreciate that this wasn't as serious as it could have been. First of all, as you mentioned, they called it a minor arthroscopic surgery. That immediately tells me they didn't have to do a big repair of the meniscus, and I'll explain why that's important in a bit. You also said, you made that reference to they removed a small portion. That means they were cleaning up something, removing maybe a fragment where the tear was, but not actually doing a repair. The reason this matters is when you repair the meniscus, you have to be much more protective of it going forward. It's a much longer recovery. It indicates that there was a portion of the meniscus involved that they would be so concerned about that they would need to repair it. The meniscus is critical in protecting the cartilage of the knee joint. So you want to preserve it as much as you can. The problem is the meniscus doesn't have a particularly good blood supply except for in one tiny portion. So healing is always an issue. If it was a more complicated repair, you'd be concerned about the integrity of the repair, first of all. It's a much longer recovery process, and it's a bigger issue going forward. If they didn't have to do a repair, if it was indeed minor, and they just had to remove a little fragment in the first place, they said he was having persistent symptoms, so they went in to address that. This is much better in terms of the future outlook for Embiid.
Stephania, I want to ask you about how you get to this point, because I know for me, I had an injury to my lateral meniscus. I didn't have surgery. They basically told me just rest, you would get better, and I was okay. Now, obviously, I'm not a 7'2", 270-pound athlete, but from what I understand about these injuries, they don't like to go in and get surgery immediately because they want to see if that heals. Is that correct?
That's absolutely true. And I think one thing to note about Embiid's case is you perhaps saw the reference that there were multiple MRIs. So what it tells me is that he was having persistent symptoms. Something was aggravating, irritating the knee. The meniscus sits inside the joint. And if there's a little flap or a piece where there's a tear that's causing irritation, it will cause the knee to stay swollen and be painful, and it makes it impossible to progress. And there was a report that the first and the second MRIs looked relatively the same, but on the third scan, it appeared that the tear was more pronounced. So if you have the combination of a player continuing to have swelling and pain, you have a concern that maybe the tear has gotten worse, then it becomes time to take the next step. Now, obviously, when they got in there, it wasn't something that required an extensive repair. So maybe when they got in there, they were able to say, this doesn't look as bad as it originally did. That we'll just clean this piece up. And now comes the point of recovering. But you also have to keep in mind the bone bruise that he was diagnosed with originally means you have to still protect the knee. That means that the bones smack together. You basically, the cartilage on the inside of the joint has taken a beating, and it may still be healthy, but from that initial contact, that bruise, it needs time to recover. So I expect you to see, and the Sixers have indicated this, a very, very slow, gradual progression for him back. There's no need to rush. The seasonal calendar really allows for it based on where we are right now. And so they will bring him back gradually with weight bearing, et cetera, and essentially transition him towards basketball activities at some point this summer.
The injury and the repair was done on his left knee. It was his right foot that had the bone break. Is it possible that there may have been some overcompensating for one leg versus the other, and that could have led to this injury?
I think it's hard to make a direct line to it, but I think what you do bring up that's really important is just the collection of Embiid's injuries over time. I mean, there's certainly, when you look at the fact that he had a stress fracture in his back while he was at KU, then he had a navicular stress fracture, that's the bone in the foot, a very, very challenging bone, also a bone with poor blood supply, and part of the reason that sometimes requires 2 surgeries, as his did. And then this, you go, okay, he's had a lot of injuries, and when a player's been down so much, it's hard for their body to be really conditioned to the sport that they need to do, because you have to be protective while they're in the recovery mode, but you also have to train their body to be ready to absorb the loads and the demands of the sport that they play. Consider that Embiid came out of KU and essentially didn't play for 2 years, and now he's playing at a different level, at the NBA level. So even though he's only played, I believe it's 31 games this season, that's a lot more than he'd done in a couple of years. So when he comes out of this latest injury, I really believe that they're going to be super attentive to adapting him to the sport of basketball and making sure he's really fully conditioned before he plays in a real NBA game.
We're talking with Stephania Bell, ESPN's injury analyst. She is a board-certified orthopedic clinical specialist. Stephania, I want to ask you because, like you mentioned, the whole history, the back, the foot, now the knee. We know that he's actually grown a couple inches since he was at Kansas. He's obviously put on a lot more size, not just length-wise, but muscle-wise as well. Is it possible that some of these injuries may just be a side effect of his body growing, his body developing, and him learning his body?
I'm certain that it's probably a factor. It's one of the many variables. I think what's tough when we're looking at a situation like this, especially with a kid who's got so much talent and yet he's been beset by all these injuries, you're trying to figure out where the problem lies. And ultimately, it's usually multifactorial. There are a number of things that play into it. It might be the shape of his body. It might be his tissue. Genetically, is he more predisposed to certain type of things? It might be just like I referenced, the conditioning that he's had year in to year out. And then you talk about changes in his body, basically a metamorphosis of putting on size, gaining the weight, gaining height, all of those things that your body needs to adapt to as it's trying to ultimately play at a higher level. Because again, he went from college to being out to playing in the NBA. And it's a tough adjustment when you're going from NCAA level to NBA level to begin with, but then you take all that time missed, it becomes that much more difficult.
Do you think that this culmination of injuries is something that should be concerning for the future of his career, or do you think this is just bad luck in the long run?
It's probably a combination of both. I mean, he's definitely had some misfortune for sure, but I think that the comment that I think it was Brett Brown that made the comment that Joel Embiid has been very active in the process in terms of making the decision about whether, not only when to go to surgery, but who would do it, and really understanding what's going on as a function of him learning more as he goes through the process.
We were talking with Stephania Bell. She is ESPN's injury analyst. She's a board-certified orthopedic clinic specialist. You've probably seen her on fantasy football on ESPN2 on Sunday mornings. Stephania, before I let you go, and I really appreciate you taking the time to join us today, I have to ask you, because we're in the middle of March Madness, your alma mater, Princeton, they won the first ever Ivy League tournament. They got into the tournament. They almost won that first game. What was your reaction to your team getting in the tournament and almost making it further?
Well, first of all, so proud. Great to have Princeton back in the tourney. We got spoiled for a bit by them going many years. I know Penn's been a frequent visitor to the Ivy League tournament. Recently, Harvard's been in, Cornell's been in. Princeton's had an absence for a while, so it was great to see them back in the NCAA tournament. The first ever Ivy League tournament, that was tough. They almost didn't get by Penn. There was an overtime game there, and I thought this would be a shame for a team that was essentially undefeated in conference play to lose out because of the installation of a tournament that we have never had before. So I was thrilled to see them go, and I actually picked them in my bracket to beat Notre Dame. Had a few wagers going on with a couple of my ESPN colleagues. We have a lot of Notre Dame folks there. And so at least they made it a very close game. I was actually overseas in Europe, so I was getting my updates by text from friends who were watching the game live, and I literally was, holding my breath because I couldn't see it. But I'm very proud of the result. They have everything to be proud of for a great season.
Are there more Notre Dame or Northwestern people at ESPN? I can't figure it out.
I can't either. And usually, and I'm hoping that Princeton is beating one. I don't know that we've come up against Northwestern, but certainly because I went to grad school at University of Miami, I'm always rooting against Notre Dame. Between Princeton and my Miami allegiance, I was really pulling for Princeton in this one. And unfortunately, they came very close. It at least made me happy that they put a scare into the Notre Dame fans.
Well, we're in New Jersey, so Princeton's nearby, so that's always a fun connection. For me personally, I'm a huge U fan, so I'm okay with you rooting on both schools for me.
Yeah, unfortunately, they both went out pretty early in the tournament, but I taught at KU for 5 years, and I picked Kansas to win the whole thing. So I still have a little semblance of something left in my bracket. I was very happy to see KU win the other night.
Well, you're doing better than probably 10 million people with their brackets, so good job. Stephania, I got
3 in my Final Four. I mean, I'm pretty lucky.
Nice. Well, Stephania, I really appreciate you joining the show today. Keep doing the great work at ESPN, and we'll look forward to seeing you on TV again soon.
I appreciate you guys having me on. Have a great weekend.
You too.